Okay, welcome everyone to Dancing Deco. My name is Alexandra O'Neill. I'm the Membership and Events Manager at the Wilsonian FIU. Today I'm joined with Oscar Rivling, our Education Manager, and our choreographer and dancer and artist of the evening, Liony Garcia. So thank you guys for joining me tonight. So the rundown of the program tonight is we're going to show Leonie's past performance of Corporal Decorum. That was taken place in the fall at the Wilsonian. And then we're gonna have a Q&A and then open up the questions for the audience. So we'll get started with the performance. So I'm going to introduce Liony Garcia. So Liony is a dancer, choreographer based in Miami, Florida. He's a graduate of the New World School of the Arts and has since danced with several local and national companies. He's currently a member of Bridget Baker's Whole Project and a resident artist at Miami Light Project. Corporal Decorum was initially presented as a work in progress as part of the Here and Now Festival 2019. Since then, it's been presented as a trio in collaboration with Wolfsonian FIU and the Miami Design Preservation League in a program titled Deco Through Dance. Its latest iteration was selected for additional funding by Miami Light Project and has been given extended time for development as part of their residency program, AIR. The next phase of the piece was set to premiere in May 2020, but due to COVID-19, the show has been tentatively postponed until the fall and the winter. Liony, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you guys for having me. I want to thank the Wolfsonian for facilitating this performance. I also want to thank, in particular, Danielle Bender for introducing me to the staff at the Wolfsonian. Everybody was so generous with their knowledge and their time, and I'm just super grateful to be a part of such an important historical and cultural institution. Thank you.
So I wanted to first ask, what inspired you to pay tribute to Art Deco and the architecture that was created during this period?
Okay, so I kind of just went through inspiration at first, and now that I have more time to kind of reflect on it, I think what inspired me about this period in particular is the sense of optimism that's carried through to the design of Miami Beach. I think the area reflects the thoughts of the designers and the public at the time. And I think that their attitudes towards the future was one that had a lot of optimism and unity. And so I think it's an amazing feat that these buildings that were built in the 30s and 40s can still convey that sense of progress today. And I think that that's my attraction towards this area, mine and many others. And through preservation efforts, we're allowed access to that today. So that is one motivation. The other is, of course, the character of the buildings, the beauty of the neighborhood in itself. The character of the buildings are very light and spirited and jazzy. And so by design, I think you have this sense of pleasure and joy in being around them. And I think it seems to me like they were using architecture as a way to uplift the human spirit. And I think there's a sense of freedom and openness that the beach truly embodies, or this, particular iteration of the beach embodies. And I think it's really tied to the American spirit. And another motivation for this, as I start to do my research, is it's to pay tribute to those figures throughout history and the present day that have deemed this area important through their activism and preservation efforts. And so, they kept this area intact for us to experience. And I think that those actions are part of a larger continuum. And I feel like this piece is a tribute to those actions, to those people. Like I said, this is the first iteration of this piece, and I'm very content with the outcome. But we're still, for me and the dancers involved and the designers, we're still researching. And the more time we spend on it, the more in love we are with this region in particular. So yeah, those are some motivations towards the creation of this piece.
I think, I can only speak for myself, but I know that I feel lucky when I get to go to work, when that happens again, that we are, in the center of kind of all of the Art Deco and all of the buildings that we get to see. So it's nice to just have that subtle reminder that, there are this kind of architectural style that was I don't know, which is still inspiring to this day.
Yeah.
Were there any particular Art Deco buildings or architect styles that you were personally drawn to?
Um, yes. So initially, when I started to consider this piece, the first image that I had was of the finial at the Delano. And so at first, what came to mind was the setting where the dancers would play in. And so for the setting, I wanted to have, or at least the images that I got at first were deconstructed elements of these iconic buildings. And the Delano was one, you know, the finial of it with these wings, these like, I don't know, these really strong kind of Egyptian wings that are on the top of it. I want, you know, it's still something that we're considering, is to, you know, reimagine them for the stage. We don't know how that's going to happen yet, but there is a plan for the future. And so the scenic elements for me came first prior to the movement. And the second part is when I started to conceptualize how I would create movement. And the Taft Hotel that's right across the Wilsonian in particular was a huge inspiration at first. So there's a molding on it that has abstracted nature. It has this acanthus leaf, and within that there's these like geometric interruptions. And for I think the first movement translation started to happen once I saw this. And this repeats also at the Webster and several other, this motif, you know, repeats in several other buildings. And the first section of the second part of the piece, which you guys just saw, the one with the Schoenberg, that canon in the beginning is all, was created from this molding at the Taft. And so that was a big inspiration. And then there's been several others. The Satai was another one, because it has this decorative element on the outside that's, it's like a Greek key. And that was a generator for a good amount of the movement as well. And architects that I admire, I've been reading The Making of Miami Beach by Alan T. Schulman, and they, you know, they talk about Lawrence Murray Dixon, and so he's an architect that I really admire, and also Henry Hohauser. I think his buildings are very fantasy driven, and I've been into those two architects in particular.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liony. I think to just kind of expand a little on the process and kind of translating these visual elements and animating them, I'm wondering if you kind of speak to the role of shadow in kind of making a building move.
Okay, this is interesting. I think as dancers, we're always considering movement. Even if you're looking at something static, we're looking at it for the shape, for the lines, you know, what's the rhythm, if there's repetition, if there's symmetry, is there a spiral, is there a curve, is it a line? So these are always things that we're trying to, it's all this visual language that we take in and then embody. And it's talked about as well. I've been reading this one book. It's titled Learning from Las Vegas by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. And there's an interview with them, and they're talking about symbolism as direct communication. And they argue that the symbolic aspects of a building, meaning its decorative elements, are the first things you come into communication with, as opposed to space. So, you know, that's an argument that they have. And for me, that was true in this case, because the first things that I was attracted to were the decorative elements. Just because I think I was already kind of seeing, I have yet to touch on the larger masses of the buildings or the points in space. So at first I wanted to create a kind of vocabulary, a language from these decorative elements. And that's kind of, I'm exploring that for this performance and also in the here and now showing that we did back in May 2019. And so the friezes, the molding, the sculptures, that's where most of the language comes from. And I chose this because it has much more information, meaning I could look at it and there are shapes, there's figurative elements, there's, you know, there's a lot of information that I can reimagine into movement. And so that's what I've been focusing on so far. The next step would be, I mean, this could go on forever at this exploration. But the next step for me would be once it starts to hit the stage, it's what's going to be the most effective to convey the larger masses of the buildings, you know? And I think that's something that's spatial that will happen once we have a larger space. So overall, I think that's kind of been the process. But I guess to just to encapsulate it, I would look at an image and either feel inspired by its narrative or its shape or the way the flow of it, the lines, or and its rhythm mainly. And then that I would take that without the dancers there and try to create a movement phrase from it.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I think something that kind of really struck me in the beginning when all the dancers emerged were these rounded mirrors, I think, were reflective surfaces that you all were carrying. And so kind of this delicate reflection that would be kind of created and bounced around the space. And even just in talking to you, I'm seeing kind of this delicate flickering of light also on yourself as well. I don't know, just going through the windows. I don't know. It was just interesting kind of to see how light is an element that's central to this as well.
Yes.
But I think, yeah, just bringing it back to the Wilsonian, we're kind of curious how your own spatial perception of the museum kind of changed through this experience and project.
It's funny, this question, sometimes I like to zoom out and see kind of like a plan, because I've been looking at certain plans of the buildings and all of that. And I could kind of map it with my experience from being there in a way, but we had to work with the lobby space. So I consider this iteration or this presentation a site-specific work, because what we would work out in the studio, myself and the dancers, would be something that was at times when we would bring it, because we had maybe a month prior, we would meet every Wednesday. So we would meet 3 times a week, and every Wednesday would be at the Wilsonian. So what would happen is that we would bring the material there, whatever movement phrases we had, and then we'd adapt it to the space, and some of it did not work at all. So I would have to, it's a partnership with the space, and I think it's perfect for 3 people, but you're not given so much freedom. It's a pretty long corridor. So how I worked the piece was starting it really far upstage, and then working it forward. And so it was a matter of trial and error, just bringing in material, seeing if it worked. If it didn't work, go back to the drawing board, try to figure out ways to make it work within the language that was already created, and with this idea of architecture. I think that was the process. It was like trial and error.
So I want to touch upon design a little bit. I kind of like the relationship between design and dance. So what is your earliest memory of design, and how does that play in the works that you continue to create today?
Oh, interesting. I think the evolution of design in general, I think this is something that's progressively getting more and more complex. In architecture, you see it very clearly, where in that period you would see a modernist building, and now you see something like Zaha Hadid. So it's just, the more information that is gathered, the more complex the buildings, I think, become. And my first experience, uh, my first experience with design, like this was a good question because it made me think of, I grew up in Cuba, and part of our recess, we would be giving these collapsible cups in plastic. And so that's how we went and got water. And so each one of us had one, and I was fascinated with this object. And it's that cup that you could just collapse, and then it has like you could carry it around. And in doing a little bit of research, I see that it was designed in the early 1900s by a designer, an inventor called William Eckert. And that's been one of those objects that to this day I'm obsessed with, like seriously obsessed with. I don't know why. And to bring it back to architecture, this was another moment arriving from Cuba. um, you know, I lived in a seaside port town in Cuba, and so there weren't highways or anything like that. And so I think the first time I was in a car, we drove down Collins Avenue to visit my aunt who lived by where the Addition is now. And I don't know if you guys remember, but there was this mural of the Fountain Blue that was right before the actual building. And this was painted by Richard Haas in 1985. And this mural, just like, for me, it was just a fantasy, And so I would think like, what's behind it? Is, all these like questions would come up as a kid. And then just visiting my aunt each time, we would come across that mural. And it was so impressionable. And I have such good memories. Sadly, I think I don't think, no, sadly it was demolished and something else is there now. But there was a conversation about replicating it, which I think is a genius idea just because it's so iconic. It's just one of those things that it was just a takeaway. Like if you came to Miami as a visitor, or if you've never been here before, it was one of those really impressionable sites. And I wish it was still around.
So it's kind of like, finding the inspiration in your backyard and, coming from Cuba and then even having it now in Miami.
Yeah. Well, the town that I lived in, Cuba, it has, the architecture is vernacular. It's like, people learn how to build houses, and it's a seaside port town. So I've never seen anything like this, but that was, that mural in particular was just got my head spinning.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you about about honoring Miami in a way that feels authentic to you. You mentioned that doing the performance at the Wilsonia was very site specific because there were certain movements or certain dance moves that you couldn't do in that space. So you had to kind of figure out what worked for you. You're honoring Miami Beach, Art Deco. So how can we continue to honor our past that still feels authentic to Miami?
So I think I'm in this project for the long haul. I think I chose to do it just because I had very limited knowledge on South Beach, yet I was kind of obsessed. So I'm trying to figure out, by doing some research and kind of throwing and dedicating myself to this project, I'm trying to figure out why that obsession is, and the more I learn, the more fascinated I am. Just recently, I've been, reading on housing reform in the 20s and 30s and how Miami Beach is adapting, certain systems that were in place for housing reform and then turning them into resort architecture. And I think that's, the more and more I learn about it, the more fascinated I am with it. And I think a way for all of us to honor, this architecture, this piece of history, which is unique in the world and unique in the history of American architecture, is to, one, educate ourselves, and two, I think, support Miami Design Preservation League, simply by just going to one of the, taking one of their tours. You're going to learn something. And I think through education, we start to gather more information, and then we become proud, proud of this city and its history and its and how it's progressed successively into this urban area. And I think that, by educating myself, the team that I'm with, I do have to mention Fredo Rivera. He helped us in the research of this, and he also gave the tour at the Wilsonian. And I think just throwing yourself in, or just going for a bike ride and looking at the buildings and doing your best to understand the efforts that are being done to preserve this area for future generations. And with that, there's this artist, his name is Job Coeljuin, and he has a conceptual piece that's called Cleaning the Right Belt Pavilion. And the Right Belt Pavilion is in the Netherlands, and it's a modern piece of architecture. And he has this one piece where he hired his aunt and mother, like several aunts and mothers, and they're dressed in traditional garb. And what they do is that part of the performance is that they tend to this building. And I think it's a beautiful gesture to pay homage, and it's just such a caring and tender thing to do. And I would love to adapt that here, like, aside from corporal decorum, which is going to be meant for the stage, I would love to do these actions that would engage the community and, bring us all together in the preservation efforts and action. There's a lot to work with. There's a lot to study. There's a lot of history here. And I think the more we know, the more, the prouder we are of the city, and just the prouder, we can be of this one moment that has progressively been kept intact throughout. So I'm super excited for the next iteration of this project. I'm very thankful to be a part of this webinar and showing my work. And like I said, this was the first iteration, but I'm extremely happy with the outcome. So I want to thank the Wilsonian and everyone else who's been involved.
Yeah, and we're excited to see that as well. So I want to open up questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box below.
So we actually have 2 questions so far, Leonie. I think we'll start with the first one.
Okay.
We have Meg who's asking, what is this glorious music and how was it selected?
Okay. Where can I go? Okay, I can answer, right? Yeah. So finding the music for this piece in particular was really challenging. It was even months before I even brought in the dancers, I was listening to pieces of music, and the first piece was something that I found later on in the process, and it's a piece, I think it's a trumpet solo. They're melodies by Philip Glass. And I have no idea how I found this piece, but the sound of it was just right for Deco. Early on, I started to look at Aaron Copland's music. I definitely knew I wanted flute. I listened to Steve Reich. Steve Reich has this piece for 11 flutes, which is a masterpiece. It's a beauty. But it was too complicated for me at the time to work. It's still something that I have in mind. And then in researching atonal music, I found this is an opera by Arnold Schoenberg, and it's called Gurlieder. And this is the opening section. It's the orchestral prelude to the larger the full opera, and it incorporates the feeling that I wanted. And this is one orchestration for it, but for the next piece, I found a different orchestration, which allows us dancers a little bit more time because this one's very speedy. And so I'm definitely going to be using that in the future. So to answer the question, it's Arnold Schoenberg's Gurlieder and Philip Glass melodies for trumpet. It's just amazing music all around.
Absolutely. Next, we have a question from Shoshana, and I'll just go ahead and read her response. The choreography and performance are both amazing, so I want to start by saying that. I was also struck by the way it felt like a complete work of art, including music and costuming. And I'm wondering, how did you choose those? Did you develop a look and sound that you wanted? And can I get a jumpsuit in my size?
The jumpsuit.
But of course, if there's a place where she can get it, she would appreciate a link.
So the jumpsuit was made by Fernando Garcia. He has a store on 125th. It's called Pink Gun Gallery, and he's fabulous, and he can make one in your size for sure. So there's, prior to, I started to work with the movement first, and then the movement was kind of the first generator, and that's all I focused on for the here and now process. But then, when we brought it to the Wolfsonian, I wanted to do something that would complement or would really communicate this streamlined style. And so I went through a lot of research on the costuming, all the way from the Bauhaus. And so Bauhaus all the way to Tom Brown, like I went all the way back, all the way to the future in a way. And I've just been researching a lot of fashion. Sonia Delaunay was one. It was just, that was a process. And then Fernando and I would throw an idea and he would say, what about in color? And I was like, no, what about white? What about in cream? I wanted at first, because at first what I really wanted was these like wearable sculptures in a way, but then that got in the way of the movement. So I'm still considering it for the larger work, but it would be a different section where not so much movement was involved. And so, in considering all of that, we came to this really simple costume that Fernando designed. I kind of gave him some directives, but he went off on his own and did his thing. And the music, like I said, was just, I started with flute. I was just looking up flute music, and I found some amazing compilations of flute. And I started with Nino Rota at first, and then, Steve Reich, Quiet City by Aaron Copland. I love Appalachian Springs. Like all these pieces of that period were really instrumental in me figuring out what I wanted. I definitely know the feeling I want for it, and it's one that reflects the architecture in the area, which is really light and spirited. And so we ended up with this piece by Arnold Schoenberg. Let's see. Yeah, and this is the first time I work with the dancers. The first time we're putting it in space. The first time I'm actually choreographing to music. So that's what you're seeing there. This piece is something that I'm developing over time. The next iteration of it will be focusing on movement as well, but just in a larger space. There's scenic elements that we have to build, and these scenic elements will be deconstructions of Deco. So kind of like preserving some of the decorative elements in polystyrofoam. That's what we've been considering with. I've been considering working with Oliver Sanchez or Olivier Palagon. They have these studios here that do that kind of work. And then I'm also thinking about projections, particularly like colorful ones, because I see everything in white, and then having these projections bring the color that came later on in the Leonard Horowitz era of South Beach. So I mean, it's something that doesn't happen overnight, and I'm really excited for the full work. I'm just, you know, chiseling away at the larger piece. But thank you for that question. I hope I answered it.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely a complete work of art in all aspects. And so luckily for Shoshana and anyone else interested, the jumpsuits are available.
The jumpsuits are available, okay?
Maybe you should have time for one last question,
Okay.
audience. So let's see here. Are there any precedents that you know of for dance pieces inspired by architecture or design, by chance?
Um,
A similar kind of philosophy.
I don't know about this similar process, but I know that architecture and dance have had a long history. That would be something that I would have to like research further. Just innately design in general, it just applies to all the fields, and it also relates back to nature and the dance, you know, because we're working with our bodies, there's no way out. You know, we have to kind of be real about how, you know, otherwise you get injured. So relating that back to design, I feel like design goes through all of it because it's this organization of nature in a way. And I'm sure, for sure that's what choreographers do. And there's some amazing choreographers exploring so many different elements. I think I'm sure this is not unique to this project. I'm sure that there's other people working in this way, from image or architecture into dance. It's just something that I'm interested in exploring, but I have to do a little bit more research to see what other choreographers are doing something similar.
I think we got a last minute question, so I think we still have a couple more minutes, so we'll just have that be the last question. The architectural inspiration is so clear, but I'm also struck by the way your dancers' bodies often mimic the lines that we see in representations of human bodies in Art Deco design. Was that intentional? Were you referencing the human element of Art Deco, or was it serendipitous?
Okay. So basically and to be honest, in this process, in this part of the process, I was really directly translating from architectural decoration, symbolism, imagery into dance. And most likely I was, of course, considering those lines because they're so present within the language of Deco. But one thing that I do want to further explore is this idea of machine and man, which is so present in all film, in architecture, especially in the north. Here down south, we have more of the tropical style deco, but that's something that I'm exploring as well. And I think in hindsight, it might have been intentional, but it's not something that I was conscious of. I was really just translating, trying to create a language that would translate those design characteristics into a moving form. Yeah.
Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say we're really excited to see how this evolves and how it's going to look in other spaces.
Yeah.
I want to thank Oscar for being my co-host tonight. I want to thank Liony for taking the time to chat with us and kind of explore his performance a little bit more. So thank you again. Thank you to all the participants who hopped on our Zoom call and shared this time with us. I also want to mention that Liony can be found on his website at lionygarcia.com. So you can check that out to stay up to date with everything that he's doing. And if you're interested in more Wilsonian program, you can check us out on our website, wilsonian.org, or you can sign up for our newsletter. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.